Welcome and thank you for joining this webinar on the power of art to address racial inequality and promote inclusion. My name is Paul Gordon Chandler and I serve as the founding president of Caravan, which is a peace-building arts NGO closely affiliated with the Episcopal Church that uses the arts to build sustainable peace around the world. I'm actually right now in Doha, Qatar, on the Persian Gulf, where I serve as the rector of the Anglican Church in Qatar. I'm actually overlooking the Persian Gulf as I speak right now. And I'm in quarantine, no less, waiting for my COVID negative test tomorrow. Our format for this hour, and it's about an hour, is that I will provide a brief overview as to our experience at Caravan of the power of art. And then we have three artists that have actually participated in various Caravan exhibitions throughout the United States and in different parts of the world that will be sharing with you about their experiences of the transformational role that art can play. And after the three of them share, then we will have a little short Q&A time, and you can actually drop your questions, write them in the chat room. And if you have a question that's addressed to a specific person, myself or one of the three artists, highlight that so we know who to address that question to. Ramses Yunan, the early 20th century renowned Egyptian surrealist painter, said, "Art is a means for destroying our way of thinking and behaving." And certainly during a time of escalating misunderstanding, tensions, and prejudices and stereotyping, at Caravan, what we've discovered is that the arts can actually be one of the most effective mediums to actually build the all too necessary bridges that need to be built in our society at this time to enhance understanding, to bring about respect, to enable sharing, as well as developing and deepening friendships with those that come from different ethnicities and races and cultures and faiths, with the overall goal of changing negative perceptions that exist and creating changes on that quest that we all have for justice and peace and harmony. And by art, we really mean all creative expressions, whether film or music or literature or theater or drama or design or animation or visual art, which is what we're going to actually focus on during this hour. As the late Nobel Prize Egyptian novelist Naguib Mahfouz said, art is the language of the entire human personality. And so at Caravan, the arts serve as kind of a starting point on which to build towards seeing the development of societies and communities that inherently respect and honor diversity and living and working together peacefully and in one context. For as long as conflict, certainly this is the case, has torn the human family apart, art has actually allowed us to see similarity within difference, offering a mode of reconciliation. This has been clearly demonstrated for us throughout the Middle East, which is where we originated. As the dynamic former Tunisian Minister of Culture, Latifa Lakhtar, said, "Creativity is the greatest way to approach our battle against those people who would destroy even the most elementary principles of life." And at Caravan, the arts serve really as a catalyst for non-violently reducing conflict, transforming relationships within the context of prejudices, and building the capacities that are required for harmonious living. Leo Tolstoy, one of my favorite novelists, Russian novelist, said, the task of art is enormous. Art should cause violence to be set aside. And it's only art that can accomplish this. So one logically asks, why art? And from our experience, we would say there are several key reasons, at least from our observation. One is there's obviously something transcendent about art. Art creates a new pathway of understanding that transcends the differences, has the power to strike us, if you will, at that deep subconscious level. The German theologian Paul Tillich said, "All arts create symbols for a level of reality which cannot be reached in any other way." So art really, in a sense, takes us into that deeper dimension, echoing kind of how one of my favorite sculptors, the British Indian sculptor, Anish Kapoor, describes his work when he says, "I'm attempting to dig away at the great mystery of being." And then he goes on to say, "We live in a fractured world, and I've always seen it as my role as an artist to attempt to make wholeness." So art, in a sense, invites us to kind of reimagine ourselves, our situations, our internal narratives. And while art definitely is not the cure, it is actually a focal point, and it kind of offers a pause. It offers a moment of reflection. And art can motivate and inspire, and it can remind us of what makes us most human. Secondly, one of the secrets of using the medium of the arts in all of this that we have found is that art is indirect in its approach to addressing very difficult and often challenging subjects and issues. And as a result, because it's indirect, it's almost like coming at it under the table. Those all too often defensive walls that come up don't. And as an indirect catalyst, art creates this kind of safe and equalizing space in which to begin real dialogue, and sensitively addresses negative stereotypes of the other, as well as actually healing often old rifts. Time and time again, we've seen the words of the 19th century Persian poet and mystic, Hafez, to be true. He wrote, "Art is the conversation. Art offers an opening for the heart. Art is at least this knowledge of where we are standing in this wonderland. We are partners straddling the universe." And in this sense, the arts aren't actually only about encouraging dialogue within diversity, but we would say they're actually about something much deeper. They're encouraging friendships, new friendships within diversity, establishing sincere human relationships that cannot be broken by the words or actions of others. So for us, the aim of art is always higher than art, for it can help us see someone different than ourselves for whom we really are, that they are actually like us. Khalil Gibran has this wonderful line. He said, "Your neighbor is your other self, dwelling behind a wall. In understanding, all walls fall down." Queen Rania of Jordan, who was the patron of one of our exhibitions not so long ago, in the foreword to the catalog for that exhibition, it was titled "I Am," and actually two of the artists this evening were part of that exhibition. She wrote this, "For isn't that the joy of art? Its ability to speak to us all about what is both familiar and unfamiliar, to be a language that transcends borders and barriers, to be the consummate diplomat, traveling the world, overcoming race and religion and rancor, and building bridges of respect and understanding between us all, north, south, east, and west." And lastly, as a result, because of what you might call the transformative power of art, artistic initiatives, what we have found is they become encounter points as they bring people together that would normally never come together. And as a result, we gain insights into the other, and it also alleviates fears that exist. And this has certainly been our case and been our experience with Caravan over the last 11 years. We originated in Cairo, Egypt, when I was working there as the rector of the International Episcopal Church in the city. And it was not long after 9/11, and there was a tremendous divide and discord, of course, at that time between the Middle East and West. We were at that time, the United States at least, was in the midst of war in Iraq. And so not only was each side distrusting the other, but they were often demonizing the other. And it started for us really with a very simple exhibition in the church where we converted the sanctuary into an art gallery. We had 20 Muslim and Christian artists, quite well-known artists within that context. And we were taken back with the success. Thousands of people came. And then we began to coordinate other bridge building artistic programs. And out of that, we started learning that the arts can actually be one of the most effective mediums to build those bridges between peoples of diverse backgrounds, culturally, racially, and religiously. And since those early days, caravan exhibitions have really brought together premier and emerging artists from all over the world, from diverse backgrounds, around timely peace building or bridge building themes. And one of the distinctives for us is that our exhibitions are usually held in heavily trafficked sacred spaces, as opposed to traditional art spaces. And one of the reasons for that is that we want to maximize, if you will, the viewership from a wider demographic than simply the art world. And the other thing I would say, well, in that context, when we talk about sacred spaces, they're often in cathedrals. So large cathedrals like National Cathedral, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, to smaller cathedrals like in the Cathedral of St. Paul in Burlington, Vermont. The other thing I would say about those sacred spaces, especially for topics that these exhibitions address, that there's already a contemplative nature in the atmosphere there that facilitates the message of the exhibition. However, we also hold them in public spaces, such as even Ground Zero, for that matter. And also, these exhibitions serve really as a catalyst for a wide range of other programs that are developed with the goal of facilitating dialogue and education, and certainly furthering understanding. And I've got to say, at Caravan, we strongly believe, especially with all that's going on right now, that it could not be timelier for the arts to play a central role in promoting peace building and a sectarian-free world. I thought I would close my initial introductory remarks with two quotes from artists, no less, that I think are very apropos at this time. The first is from that renowned late composer and conductor, Leonard Bernstein. He said, "The point is, art never stopped a war. That was never its function. Art cannot change events, but it can change people. It can affect people so that they are changed, and then they act in a way that may affect the course of events by the way they behave and the way they think." And secondly, perhaps no words are more no words resonate perhaps better than the words of one of my favorite artists, one of I think a lot of our favorite artists, and those are the words of that profound Dutch artist, Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh. And he writes, "The more I think it over, the more I feel there is nothing more truly artistic than to love people." And it comes down to that. Now, we have the privilege of having with us on this panel three very accomplished artists that are celebrated in various art circles, various places around the world. Alia Ali, Jerome Meadows, and Helen Zuge. And we are going to actually go in that order. They're each going to actually take a session. They're going to visually also show you their work, ultimately talking to you about their experience of the transformative power of art and why that has been. Alia Ali. Alia, it's always wonderful to introduce someone that I know so well. Alia Ali is a Yemeni, Bosnian, American multimedia artist and a visual storyteller, having traveled to numerous countries, over 60, lived in 7, grown up around 5 languages. Her most comfortable mode of communication is through image and multisensory mediums. As a child of 2 linguists, Alia believes that the interpretation of verbal and written language has disserved particular communities and presents more of a threat than a means of understanding. And it's for this reason that Alia's aesthetic interests stem from people, place, and the processes which unite and divide us all at once. She's currently working on a trans-global project called People of Pattern, whereby she's exploring cultures and their stories through the medium of textile and the processes of making them. She's a graduate from the United World College of the Atlantic and holds a BA in Studio Art and Middle Eastern Studies from Wellesley College. Her studio is based in New Orleans and Marrakesh in Morocco, And she's off soon on a fellowship to Roswell, New Mexico. A lot of things have happened in Roswell in the past, and you're the new thing. Alia Ali, it's our privilege. Welcome.
Thank you. Let's get situated. So I'm honored to have been brought onto this panel by Bishop-elect Paul Gordon Chandler. Thank you so much. Whose work for years and years has emboldened the voices of those who have not only been drowned out, but who have also been silenced. And perhaps I would have been one of them had it not been for Paul Gordon. So thank you, and for being a part of the Caravan Arts family. A little bit about me. My name is Alia Ali. Thank you for the beautiful introduction. I come from two countries that no longer exist, Yugoslavia and South Yemen. My parents, they're linguists, and between them, they actually spoke 7 languages, but shared only one, English. There's an Arabic saying where every language that one speaks is another soul that they have. From an early age, I saw how language was used as a tool, a way in which we can communicate and learn from each other. And though it was not only something that was verbal, but also gestural, and most importantly, in my regard, visual. At the age of 13, we left Yemen. That was in 1998, where I had grown up till that point, and we moved to the United States. We first landed in Detroit and then moved to Bloomington, Indiana. And it was there where we experienced the horrific events of September 11th. After 2 weeks, my father would come home after having been fired from his job and told us that we would, from that day forward, stop speaking Arabic. But also from that day forward, I suddenly started to recognize that not only did our language, Arabic, become a threat, but so did our identity. When asked what inspires me to make art, my answer is quite simple: rage. As an artist, I've taken that rage that is layered in experiences of war, trauma, oppression, and racism, and I process it and turn it into something beautiful. At least I try to. I try to heal through it and hopefully heal with others. This is from a series that Paul Gordon had mentioned, I Am, which was commissioned by Caravan Arts, bringing female identifying artists from Southwest Asia and North Africa to respond to the statement, I am. Seeing is an act of power, but so is being seen. And in response to the statement, I am, I investigate the theme in terms of what, in fact, I am not. In these auto portraits, I wove newspaper to create a barrier between myself and the viewer. I am both the photographer and the subject, the observed and the observer, playing on the power between these two. These pieces question the fabricated barriers in society that in fact vilify the other while nodding to the media and to our politicians. Who holds the power to create an identity, I ask? And how can we break through that lens and the gaze from which others view us? Perhaps it's better for us to embrace the multiple layers of what creates our complex identities by living on the borders of all of what we are, rather than continually struggling with the abridged stereotypes imposed by others. And this leaves the question of, what do we really know of anyone? And aren't we all enveloped in these stereotypes that are created by the other to therefore consider us the other? And the more we allow these labels to seep into our judgment, the more of a boundary we weave between each other, becoming both the victim and the culprit all at once. The word text comes from the word textile. It's not the other way around, meaning the woven word. Julia Bryan Wilson, in her book, Fray, Art and Textile Politics, talks about textile politics as textile as a form of giving a grain to politics, right? And so textile is something, it's a material that has actually followed me throughout my entire practice. It's something that I work very closely with. It's quite significant to me, and I would argue, in fact, that it's significant to all of us. We are born in it, we sleep in it, we eat on it, we define ourselves by it, we shield ourselves with it, and eventually we die in it. It somehow unifies all of us, and yet it physically and symbolically divides us. And this paradoxical relationship is something that I'm really quite interested in. And it exists in the most familiar things around us, like I mentioned with textiles, but also language. So I approach this body of work using thread, textile, and photography, both of which can be used as tools, but also as weapons, forms of expressions, but also a means of threat. My Yemeni grandmother communicated through her textiles, namely through embroidery, dyeing, and weaving. So we come from an oral history where our stories and our narratives are passed down. That's how they're passed down orally through generations. However, my grandmother, for example, although she was illiterate in reading and writing Arabic and Hebrew, she was extremely literate in motif. And whether or not those would kind of exist in these dresses in ways that were tribal, historical, religious, cosmic, or even mythical. Our stories, unfortunately, were then told by our colonizers, and they were written by people who were not us, the British, in a language that was not ours, in English, for people who were not us. And so our narrative was abducted. In other words, our stories were never told on our own terms. And so this series, to me, these dresses are basically essentially documents of how we see our culture, our heritage, and ourselves on our own terms. I'm reclaiming this stance by looking at Yemen through its beauty rather than its suffering, which we so commonly see through the media. It's only through this lens that we can know really what's at stake during the systematic erasure of Yemeni communities and heritage, which is not only being wounded by, but is actually being permanently scarred by imprints of power and by destruction. For the next series, I look at fabric as a representation and a portrait of a culture. But what happens when that culture is being erased? What does that mean to its diaspora? And what does it mean to its future? In Islam, it is believed that Prophet Muhammad is escaping from people who are trying to capture him. An angel tells him to rest in a cave where he's concerned of being trapped, but the angel insists for him to have faith, and so he goes into the cave. Meanwhile, a spider weaves a web across the entrance of the cave, and those who are trying to capture him realize that it would have been impossible for him to have entered the cave in the first place, otherwise it would have been broken. They move on, and so the prophet is protected. It is for this reason that Muslims are never to kill a spider, as they are considered to be barakah, blessing. Something so small that produces something so seemingly fragile and yet incredibly resilient. In these photographs in this series called Under Thread, playing on the term under threat, I think of how thread can protect us, but also harm us, very much like a government. It protects us, but it can also suffocate and stifle us. I combine thread and photography again into an installation addressing paradoxical notions surrounding conflict and peace, active participation, and passive absenteeism, thinking of these images both as mugshots, but also as passport images, and the unraveling of really trying to reveal who is beneath the suffering. This led me to a work that I've actually taken 2 years to work on called Conflict is More Profitable Than Peace. In fact, I went back to graduate school at the California Institute of the Arts, where I spent the last 2 years. And when I started it, there was this need as an artist, there's this responsibility in a way to respond to where we come from and the traumas that our communities go through. Sometimes it's a burden, but it certainly came to a point where at the time we were in the 4th year, now we're entering the 6th year of one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world in Yemen. And on August 9th, 2018, 42 children were on a field trip in Lahya in Yemen. They were massacred by an incorrectly targeted Lockheed Martin bomb and were initially considered targets and would later be acknowledged as collateral damage. This was a case in which I was not able to turn my rage into something beautiful. So instead, I chose to do the research and do the labor of myself trying to understand the why and who, and hopefully transferring this to my audience. I worked with two reporters, Robert Worth from the New York Times and Nasser Rabi'i, who was based in Yemen, to track down the names of the victims of the Hyan. But I also wanted to know the names of the culprits. And so, of course, making lists and compiling lists of politicians, of lobbyists, of companies, of governments, but also eventually I would find that my name was also on that list as a US taxpayer. I chose to focus it on the weapons manufacturing companies. And from then I started to build the narrative of different timelines, different narratives of which, and different histories essentially, and lots of lists. And so I could no longer essentially look away from from Twitter, because in fact the media was purposefully ignoring many of the things. So I was following Twitter, Yemeni Twitter actually, who were actually bearing witness to what was happening. However, it was in Arabic, and so it was blocked for many people to access it. My studio became engulfed in a mapping of documents, all connected by thread, like a web, trying to weave together a meaning and therefore an understanding. This research would eventually manifest into a binder, which is still ongoing. I'm now on the third binder, and the first binder was 498 pages. And in order to make it more accessible, I actually created a film which will be available, and I will post it online. It is 17 minutes and it's easily accessible on Vimeo. So going back to the 16-year-old I was during September 11th, language has been abducted from me, from all of us who are Arabophones. I would eventually do my undergraduate studies in political science and studio arts. The media and politicians during this time in the early 2000s would pull specific words and propagandize them so much that we could no longer use them. To this day, there's a consistent code switching that occurs among Arabic speakers who are moving from one space to another, from one country to another, and one audience to another. The very obvious one is going from the street into an airplane or a mode of transportation. So we'll do a little experiment here, a language experiment. The word talib, for example, if one would say talib, we're quite familiar with that. It's related to the word Taliban, which is a terrorist group. The next word that that I'd like to introduce to you is madrasa. So this is an image that I looked on Google yesterday as I was preparing this slideshow. And as you can see, madrasa immediately on Google is described as an Islamic religious school where Taliban were educated, and is essentially sort of like a religious training camp. When I looked at the images for the word, these are the images that come up. And what I see is mostly masculine, Muslim certainly, and also in some cases quite violent. As a linguist, as a child of linguists, I know that transliteration can change. So I changed one S and I took away. And now we see an introduction of more architectural, but still it lends itself to a little bit more of a religious school. When I type it in Arabic, the word madrasa, these are the images that come up. And when I type the translation into English, this is the word that comes up. These are the images that come up. So essentially, madrasa is the only word that we have for school. So if I were to say, ana taliba fil madrasa, perhaps somebody would acknowledge that I am a terrorist in a training camp, but in fact, it's the only word that we have for student. I am a student in school, as we all are. The Arabic, so my new series, Hub, meaning love, aims to reclaim the beauty and non-violence of the Arabic language. For this exhibition, I invited non-Arabophones to learn. If there's one word that I want non-Arabophones to be able to identify, read, say, and spread is the word hub, love. This can now be exhibited, be seen at the Benton Museum in Los Angeles. And I will be leaving you with hope and with love. And for the last words, I will say that art has become a prop in a way for me, which I've been able to have the most intimate conversations with people around ideas, experiences, traumas, and most importantly, a form of collective healing. It not only moves us by instituting dramatic emotional and personal shifts, but it also moves us as a people, as humanity, into more thoughtful ways of being, thinking, and coexisting. If COVID in these last months of quite trying times has taught me anything, it's knowing the importance of how we all collectively crave the flavors of life by the creativity of the cultural producers from which they are made. So I'd like to thank you for the platform that you've provided, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Alia Ali. Jerome Meadows. Jerome Meadows is a celebrated studio artist working and residing in an historic ice house, and you see it in the backdrop there where he's sitting right now, in the exotic city of Savannah, Georgia. Originally from New York City, he received his BFA degree from Rhode Island School of Design and MFA from the University of Maryland. One of his primary focuses has been in the design and fabrication of large-scale public art projects, which are located throughout the United States, of which a number relate to African-American history and civil rights. His sculptural work for the African Burying Ground in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was awarded a 2013 National Endowment for the Arts grant. Other major public art commissions are found throughout the United States, and he'll share a little bit about those. He's currently working on the Ed Johnson Memorial at Walnut Street Bridge in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which remembers Ed Johnson, a 24-year-old African-American man who was lynched there in 1906. Jerome has exhibited in some of America's most respected museums. He's won numerous awards. He's received numerous fellowships, not just within North America, but in various places around the world. He's actually exhibited with us in Cairo, Egypt, as well. It's our privilege to have with our privilege for us to have Jerome with us this afternoon. For me, it's nighttime. Go ahead. And you have to take your mute off there, Jerome.
Thank you so much, Paul Gordon. It's an honor and a privilege and a joy to be a part of such a distinguished panel. Just to give a little background on the genesis of my journey. Born and raised in the Bronx, New York City, then moved to Harlem, and then from there to Sugar Hill. All of which was a very, I shall say, traumatic experience for me. And also provided one of the first instances in which I began to realize the power of art. I want you to try to imagine now a young child living in a tenement on the 6th floor, the elevated train passing by on a regular basis, with the elevated train tracks, essentially the sunlight that filtered down onto that urban street was in rectangular blocks, if there was sunshine at all. There's gunfire, there's gang warfare, and yet this child is sitting at the dining room table and he's drawing horses. Horses as friends, horses communicating with one another, horses running across the prairie. And obviously there were no horses to be found in his actual environment. So years later, I realized that that was the power of art to provide a different perspective on environments in which we actually live. And it was sustaining for me. I was able to avoid gang membership. I was able to avoid drug addiction because I had my horses to show me a better way. During college, in the civil rights era, one of the phrases that struck me the most was, if you're not a part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And this is speaking in terms of societal issues, political issues, you name it. And it seems so telling that we are still now dealing with those same, that phrase is so applicable to our current social condition. If you're not a part of the solution, then consider that you might be part of the problem and be mindful of what your actions imply. But I guess it was also growing up in those kinds of environments, and this sort of relates to, I guess, a issue that Alia was expressing. all of my studios, ironically, have been in environments like the one I grew up in, with one exception. And that was this beautiful little cottage or house up on a mountain in Massachusetts. Maybe 5 or 6 cars would pass during the day. It was idyllic to the max. And I found myself, I had a studio, but I found myself very content to be occupying a little yellow room up on the 2nd floor, enjoying the beauty of nature. We moved from there into Albany, New York, and again, back into different environments or different locations that all had the similar characteristics of urban plight and social discord. And so I came to realize that there was this philosophy, I call it the pearl and the oyster, because it seemed to be that irritant that was compelling me to make art. And some of that art, for therapeutic reasons, was to beautify or create a beautification of my environment. But other aspects of it were to address what those dynamics were caused by. And that set me on the course of large-scale public art projects. So with that said, I want to use my projects to demonstrate what my purpose has been, what my position is when it comes to the real importance of public art in addressing the social, societal conditions that we face currently and have been facing, and trying to address them in a way that we can finally get beyond this. So the first project is, as Paul Gordon mentioned, is the Portsmouth African Burying Ground in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And this slide shows you Chestnut Street, a developed urban residential environment, downtown Portsmouth. And these are indicators, these white lines are indicators of burials that took place underneath Chestnut Street, or before it was Chestnut Street, when Portsmouth, believe it or not, as a main slave trading port, had several enslaved people brought in for sale and for use there. These bodies indicate just a portion of the 200 remains that were believed to be underneath Chestnut Street. And I want to point your attention to the yellow line that runs the length of Chestnut Street, because this indicates where the sewer line was that in 2003 needed to be repaired. It was then that this burial ground was rediscovered. But if you consider what this says, in 2003, the city workers laid this sewer pipe on top of known remains of individuals. So if we can have the next one, please. And so this is what happens when instead of saying, okay, we've got a job to do, let's lay the pipe, we're on the clock, let's fill it up and get out of here. When finally a city agrees to acknowledge what is essentially a horrendous event, the desecration of a sacred space. Next. And so I was honored to be commissioned to create a memorial. And to the city's credit, after all that time, bringing in archaeologists and historians and activists and really creating an uproar, which was to be expected, the city realized or determined that public art, a cultural statement, would be the best way of restoring this as a sacred space and acknowledging not only what had happened, but how contemporaneous society should be looking at it. If I could have the next, please. And so I created the African Burying Ground Memorial. And this is sort of the formal entry, which is a granite slab, 9 feet tall, with an individual representing the first enslaved person brought into Portsmouth. Next. And on the other side of that stone is a figure representing Mother Africa. And they are reaching towards one another around the stone, and their fingers are not quite touching, which begs you to consider, is this because they're being pulled apart, or is this because they're finally coming together? And one unexpected feature of this memorial is you can see the flowers in Mother Africa's hands. Every day since this was dedicated in 2015, unknown individuals have been placing these flowers in her hand. Next, please. And so at the opposite end of the street is what I'm calling the Plaza of Remembrance. And one of the main intentions of this plaza was to eventually stop the street from being used as a thoroughfare. I mean, talk about disrespect. So this plaza contains these stylized figures representing the contemporaneous community, finally acknowledging and honoring what this site is about. That Sankofa symbol that you're looking at is the lid to a vault that I designed into this plaza, because the remains of 8 individuals were exhumed for archaeological studies, and they were reburied in this vault. And that symbol, if you're not familiar with it, is called the Sankofa, and it is a philosophical symbol that says, go back and fetch it. And it just seemed appropriate that this would be utilized in this area. Next, please. And so one of the things that I found most moving about this project was that not only was it the creation of a public art space, a memorial on a city street, but it entailed ritual. Collective ritual. And as you can see, there's flowers laying on top of the boxes that contain the remains that were reburied. And that was left open, excuse me, that was left open for quite a while, enabling people to place their offerings in honor of the deceased. So that these 200 individuals were finally being acknowledged and honored after all of this time. And then the lid was placed, or was put in place and permanently sealed. Yes, next. And so it's a matter of creating an environment in which the stories that have been overlooked, that have been dismissed, that have been considered unimportant, non-essential, can finally be given voice, and done so in such a way that the collective of the community comes forth and begins to realize that these are humanitarian issues. And as human beings, we can find common cause and common connections through them. I should say also that each of these figures has the line of a poem that I wrote. I stand in honor of those forgotten. Okay, next, please. I'll say this, okay, this is the project that I'm currently working on in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the Ed Johnson Memorial, which is underway, and we're looking to have this dedicated ideally on the anniversary of Ed Johnson's lynching, which was March 19th, as Paul Gordon indicated, 1906. Just briefly, Ed Johnson was targeted as the culprit based on very flimsy information. A trial was held, a mock trial. 12 individuals were at this trial as witnesses in his behalf, and indicated that he could not have committed this crime because he was with them at the quote unquote last chance saloon in Chattanooga. And yet, during this time in Chattanooga's history, as well as a lot of other cities throughout the US, mob violence prevailed. And the mob was not having any acceptance of Ed Johnson being anything other than a guilty beast dehumanized, and they eventually seized Ed Johnson out of the county jail, marched him along Walnut Street, and lynched him from the Walnut Street Bridge. So this memorial, to its credit, is adjacent to the bridge. If I get the next one, please. And this is just another image of the site that the memorial is taking shape in. I should mention that there were other individuals who were lynched from this bridge. One other individual, Alfred Blunt, was lynched there in 1893. And I learned upon, I had been visiting Chattanooga for quite some time as this memorial came about and I became involved in it. I learned that there were several members of the African-American community there who refused to cross the bridge because it was known that this heinous act had happened, and yet there was no acknowledgement of it until now. Next. And so from a design point of view, in relating the location of the memorial to the bridge itself, I drew an axis from the point on the bridge where Ed Johnson was lynched, and I drew that through the site of the memorial. So that's what this indicates. Next, please. And this is a rendering of the final design that we came up with. I had a team working with me, landscape architect, stonemason. And so this will give you an idea of what the footprint of this memorial entails. Next. And so Ed Johnson, in my mind, is finally walking away from the travesty, the horror of his lynching. I should say that the mob lynched Ed Johnson, and thinking that he was still alive, shot him 50 times. One of those bullets severed the rope. He fell to the bridge pavement, and thinking that he was still alive or just being rabid dogs, they shot him 5 more times. But Ed Johnson, prior to their lynching him, was asked to admit his guilt. And instead, Ed Johnson, very calmly, after all of this horror, told them, "God bless you all. I am an innocent man." So there's a level of grace there that has been inspiring for me in terms of designing this memorial. So this is a street level view looking into the memorial from the Walnut Street Plaza, which is also currently under construction. Next, please. And this will take you inside of the memorial. That squiggly line there is what I'm calling the stream of time. It transects the circular disc that Ed Johnson and his 2 lawyers are standing on. Noah Parton and Styles Hutchins, 2 Black lawyers that were courageous enough to step forward and valiantly try to save Ed Johnson's life, unfortunately to no avail. Next slide. And so these are just very quickly, I know you can't read it, perhaps I can share it afterwards. This is a poem that I was inspired to write. We see Ed Johnson walking, and these are 3 views of the initial clay model that I presented for the during the competition. And then one more. And so to honor or acknowledge and honor the 3 other individuals who were lynched in Chattanooga during this time frame, these abstracted forms are placed going down a slope which goes down to the river, representing those who have been forgotten, so that we're not overlooking all of those who suffered under mob violence. So essentially, my service, if you will, as an artist, as a public artist, has been designing and creating these sorts of large-scale public art projects. They're permanent. They're based on storytelling, and they're based on creating spaces in which people can come together and acknowledge the untold stories and find ways of connecting. Before I go to the next project real quickly, those curved bands that you see on the plaza there contain quotes by different individuals, one of which was from a woman whose name I have not yet ascertained, but it says, "I wasn't there to care then, but I am here to care now." And that just struck me as being really, really important as we currently grapple with issues from the past, as well as issues that have come about as a result of our contemporaneous dynamics. So most of these projects are permanent outdoor pieces, but I've also discovered a way of giving voice and expression to community issues that I call blank page poetry, words and shadows. So if I could have the next image.
Jerome, we've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, this is 1 minute and 25 seconds.
Okay, great.
Okay. So this is a short clip that I would like you to check out.
It really has nothing to do with sectarian or religious doctrine, or whether somebody's Christian or Jewish or Muslim or nothing. It transcends all that to a shared spiritual experience.
For all intents and purposes, we become raceless in shadow. It sort of distills us down to something that is more essential, mystical, spiritual. Everything we know about our existence on this planet, we know from cultural context.
Walk with me in rhythm and rhyme down Waters Avenue while there's still time. Changes are coming, and it won't be kind. Soon, Waters Avenue will blow your mind.
We celebrate births and we mourn for our dead, weaving a tapestry of each garment.
In that dairy's horse-drawn wagon, clopping on that dusty street.
Okay, so I know my time is short. That's a little taste of what blank page poetry, words and shadows is. The connection with the projects that I showed just a minute ago is that as with those projects being based on stories within a community, events within a community, I come into the community, in this case, working with St. Peter's Episcopal Church, whose church exists on the more affluent end of Waters Avenue, against my studio on the end of the avenue that is more in need. And I learned the stories. I try to just ascertain what the stories are and create ways of giving voice to those stories. In this case, working with poets, some of which are established and others are bedroom poets. You know, they do their poetry and they don't think of themselves as poets, but their words have value with respect to conveying what the concept is. And in this case, it was threading together the various aspects, life ways, businesses, cultural institutions that exist along this corridor, this major corridor in Savannah, known as Waters Avenue. So yes, I think my time is up.
Okay. Thank you. Jerome, it's an honor. Thank you for sharing with us.
For my pleasure.
Our last artist, and by the way, time-wise, I just give you a heads up, we're going to go for until 1/4 after, okay? So, Helen, you don't feel crunched here.
Okay.
Helen Zuge was born in Beirut, Lebanon, living in the Middle East and Europe before coming to the United States to study art at Syracuse University. Currently, she lives in Washington, D.C., and she paints primarily using gouache on board and canvas and mixed media installations. Her work has been exhibited in galleries and museums throughout the United States, Europe, the Middle East. Her paintings are included in many collections, including at the White House, World Bank, Library of Congress, and embassies throughout the world. She's received grants from the DC Commission on Arts and Humanities. Her paintings this is what I like to often introduce her as. She actually her work's been gifted to heads of state by President Obama and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I often say, bragging about her, she's one of Obama's favorite artists. So as an Arab American, Helen feels that her background in the Middle East allows her to approach the experiences that she has in America in a very unique way, remaining an observer of both the Arab and American cultures. And she's participated in numerous caravan exhibitions around the world as well. Helen Zuge, our privilege.
Thank you. Okay. Please come up. Okay. So can everyone hear me and see me? All of the panelists? Okay. Paul Gordon, thank you so much for this huge honor. Thank you to the church and the people that are behind the scenes that we can't see. Of course, our audience. What an honor to be with you and to be speaking alongside Alia Ali, who I know, and Jerome, who I'm just learning about. You guys are so amazing. I was nodding my head, you know, thinking about so much of the things that you were talking about. It seems like our paths cross in such an interesting way. And I see why Paul Gordon brought us all together on this panel. You know, I heard so many themes: reconciliation, telling stories, identity, you know, appreciating the other, trying to put oneself in one's shoes. And I feel that my work also talks to those important issues, certainly now more than ever. As an Arab American, like Alia, I'm a Lebanese origin. My father born in Damascus to Lebanese parents at the time of the French Mandate when there were no borders. And it was called the Big Syria, the Grand Syrie. And so there were no borders. And anyways, after being evacuated from 2 wars there, the last one, the Civil War, I didn't return for 35 years. And I will talk a little bit about that later. I came to America. I'm living in Washington, D.C., working here. And, you know, as artists, I see that we all respond to our environment and what's going around us. And I heard also you incredible artists talk about giving voice to the voiceless. I feel also that's a very important part of my work. Alia Ali mentioned 9/11. I was here in Washington at that time. And was invited to participate in a very large exhibition that ultimately traveled around the world. This is my contribution to that, Prayer Rug for America, where I, as an Arab American, have wrestled with this idea of East and the West and tried to bring it together in a place of introspection. If you look down in the right-hand corner, you'll see a little pair of shoes. And what I'm asking here, and Paul Gordon referred to this also too, these art in sacred spaces, to come in and be calm and think about what is going on. Think about your emotions, think about your reactions. And I know rage is part of artists moving forward, but I also think a spirituality as well too, which plays a big part of my work. So hopefully I'm going to the second slide. It's not moving. I don't know why. Okay. Is that coming up now, Paul Gordon? The second slide? Okay. I'll move through these fairly quickly. This piece is in response to our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And here is another sort of spiritual piece. I'm asking for people to reflect. And of course, living in America at the time of 9/11 was very, very divisive and much stereotyping, as Alia also referred to. I myself was the the beneficiary of quite unpleasant behavior by people who knew that I was an Arab. And like Alia too, I decided to not let anybody know that I was Arab anymore. I just pretend I'm Spanish or Italian or something else and not acknowledge that part of me until it became like I felt it was my duty to share our story, to say it from our way, not to have the news or other people talk about us. Paul Gordon referred to this piece in the White House. This was given to President George Bush by Rafiq Hariri, who was assassinated actually in 2005. One of the people who came to my studio to select the work actually was blown up in that horrible assassination. But here I'm depicting Martyrs Square in Lebanon, a very famous square where for thousands of years the church has lived beside the mosque. And Rafiq Hariri rebuilt it after the war. It was heavily damaged in the war. I'm going to go through these little segments touching on the themes that we've talked about. This is from Stories My Father Told Me, a series of 25 paintings, and my father's true stories and recollections from Syria and Lebanon before he immigrated to America in 1946 as a young man. And these also, they came about 2003 until about 2015. He kept telling me stories and we would document them and I would paint them. And this is planting olive trees. It was important at this time when these were exhibited to show these to primarily Western audiences who decided they had made up their mind about what was Arab. Or were we all terrorists? Or were we, Islam is horrible? All these stereotypes and negativity that was coming out. If you read the stories that accompany these paintings, you will see the shared humanity, the shared traditions, culture, empathy. And this is my way also of combating that rage that we felt after 9/11. This is Feast of the Cross, and this is when, I put this in for the church members, when Saint Helena, evidently, she locates the cross that was used in the crucifix, and to let all the different villages know, they lit bonfires from mountaintop to mountaintop to mountaintop to exclaimed the news that the crucifix had been found. And in Lebanon, this is a very traditional feast that they have. They celebrate this every year. I'm not going to go, I'll show you all of them, but just to give you a little example of that. Here, I am talking about a group of paintings. They're women. And this is called my Changing Perception series. Here we have the abaya with a flag pin. I don't know if you remember when President Obama, Senator Obama was running for election, he was lambasted because he didn't actually wear a American flag pin. So he was something less than patriotic according to people trying to thwart his ability to run. So I also flipped that around a little bit here, also talking about if you're Muslim American, you're not really American. I've used this abaya. After Afghanistan, people called it burqa, but in the Middle East, we call it abaya. Alia knows that. This is self-explanatory. Here, also, with a bit of humor, I'm changing the dialogue, or hope to, using recognized Western artists, mixed, once again, the West and the East in a combination that changes the story, or at least invites dialogue. This piece refers to implicit bias, and we all have that. And certainly it's something we're dealing with today. Bias against Arabs, bias against other people, other races, other religion, on and on and on. And one day after my 1,000th trip to CBS to get a Coke, and I was watching this campaign that they had rolled out, share a Coke with Mary, share a Coke with Nancy, Edward, and so on. And I thought, wow, I'm gonna have someone share a Coke with Yasser or Muhammad or something like that. So this is actually acrylic gouache on canvas. So humor and irony can make your point as well. This is the piece that Paul Gordon was referring to that President Obama gave to the then Prime Minister Maliki of Iraq at the White House. Sadly, I was not invited to go to the White House, but my painting was there. This happened as a result of another trip that I was invited by State Department as cultural diplomacy and art exchange program, arts envoy program, where I spent 1 month in Palestine and the West Bank. This is one of the paintings that I did in envisioning a less volatile Middle East, let's put it that way. Midnight prayers. Also in Islam, there is that early morning prayer that would always wake me up. And I was always wishing it would be a little bit later. I'm jumping through many, many different slides to cover these points that I wanted to make with you today. I finally returned to Beirut and Syria and Jordan after 35 years. When we left, my father said it was going to be a week. Come back 35 years later. Shortly after I came back to America, the Arab Spring began. This is the first piece that I did, indicating the optimism and the hope and the possibility for change and more, let's put it this way, equality and so on and so forth in the Middle East, which didn't really pan out. There are plenty of pieces in that series. I won't go through them all. I also began painting these little children's shoes, and I'm taking off on Dr. Seuss and his book, Oh, the Places You'll Go. And here we are now witnessing the most historic displacement of people in history, 13 million Syrians primarily, and watching them cross borders and try and leave their war-torn country. As you know, the Syria dissipated into dissolved all those words into a war. I was corrected not to call it a civil war like Lebanon, where I'm from, but a war. Because it wasn't people against people. It was more, not too much in the politics, but the regime against the people, so a war. This painting was a difficult one. I wrestled with the idea of putting it in this series, my Syrian Migration series, and I decided to, because I didn't want to have this little boy forgotten. And it seemed that this world, in its fast-moving pace, you know, we pay attention for half a second. I love the permanence of your sculptures, Jerome. I love that because people are going to come face to face with that every day. It will be in their face. I love that. I think it's a little more fleeting with the visual, this kind of situation here. You can see that this is a little boy, the Syrian boy, Aylan Kurdi, who was found by the Turkish soldier here. He still had his little shoes on. I had been painting those shoes and continued to paint them, and still till now, this is still growing. Until I was invited to do a silk screen. This is an 11-color silk screen with Navigation Press. And here again, it's this idea of walking into a sacred space. And to see that these shoes, if you want to put yourself in someone else's shoes, think of the other person. Shoes are important to me as well. I think of them as you put on your shoes to run away from danger, and you put on your shoes to run towards your dreams and hopes. After the big explosion in Lebanon, I heard a reporter, she was in the middle of that, and she was telling us her story on the news, and the first thing she did was try and grab her shoes. And all she found was some sandals that were a bit flimsy to run out of her burning building. They're very significant, the shoes, so I use them quite often. I put this slide up. This is my latest series of work inspired by the great Jacob Lawrence, which I did have the honor to meet before he died at the Phillips Collection, when they had a retrospective and all 60 panels were reunited at the Phillips Collection here in Washington, D.C. It was I tried not to wash my hands for like, I don't know how long after that, because I got to shake his hand. Jacob Lawrence painted 60 panels in 1940 and 1941 that he called the Migration Series, documenting the great migration of Blacks from the South to the North that began after the Great War and documented to end around 1970 or so. Approximately 6 million African Americans traveled and made that journey. And the reason I decided, I was thinking about that and his migration series. I'm thinking about how much impact the Syrian massive displacement affected the world. Not just for me personally, but the massive movement of people going into countries, mostly they were not welcome. And they had no choice. I assure you, they didn't want to leave their homes. They were met with all kinds of blocks and not being wanted and barriers to them trying to seek shelter. And so I thought, I'm going to do the Syrian migration loosely based on Jacob Lawrence. And each of his panels record a short narrative that basically is the timeline of the movement of African Americans to the North. I also echoed that here. I'm not showing them now here, but I document the movement and the timeline of the beginning of the revolution in Syria until now. The story isn't finished. We are still talking about it. They're still living it. They're still trying to seek shelter in Idlib, the northern province with Syria and Turkey. So this is sadly ongoing, but it is off the news. We don't talk about it anymore. And here again, Alia and Jerome speaking about giving a voice and keeping these stories alive. This is Jacob Lawrence's piece, and you see my interpretation. This refers to the blockades at the borders and the refusal and the very anti-immigrant, anti-refugee stance, which we're still facing today. Many governments became very conservative, and a big part of their agenda was anti-immigration. We face that here in this country. This piece is part of the series, though not directly related to Jacob Lawrence, but here I'm talking about people crossing the Mediterranean, whereas Little Island, Kurdi too, and you saw what happened there. But how many people trying to reach safe shores, and it's very, very difficult to be, think of it. It's hard to do these paintings, actually. I don't know, it's hard. Yet another one. As I said, they're 36 now, I think. You know, the one thing that I wanted to point out here, I read Jacob Lawrence in his work use the elements of beauty and pattern and color to show dignity and pride. I also do that in my work as well. I'm not talking about a very nice, you know, thing that's been going on. I'm using beauty, I think, as to, Alia, we talked about that too, the idea of beauty to change perceptions. So you can look at something painful and try and hear what I'm saying. Because if it's so horrible for you to look at, you're going to turn away. This is the end, Paul Gordon, so get the thing and drag me off. This is a very brand new piece called Muffled. Here, I also refer to silencing that Alia was talking about. In this pandemic, we all know now what it is to be veiled. I insert I can't breathe because here, especially in Washington, D.C., the seat of power here, and with many protests and much destruction of property as well, and a brand new Black Lives Matter plaza, which was renamed across from St. John's Church, where was a scene of quite a bit, and still till now. We had these double pandemics going. So here, I also refer to global injustice and a global giving voice to people who don't have voices. I think I feel very, very strongly about that as a woman, as an artist, and as the only way that I myself can talk. I don't have a magic wand, but there's so much more. But we want questions, right, Paul Gordon? That's my last, I'm gonna get out of there. You gotta unmute. Paul Gordon, you gotta unmute yourself.
Thanks for that reminder, Helen.
Sure.
Thank you. I think question-wise, we haven't actually received, we've answered some as we've gone along, and I have. And so I think we're okay. Time-wise, I believe we're gonna stop because we had committed early on to around an hour. I do wanna thank Alia Ali, Jerome Meadows, and Helen Zuge for the gift of this time together. I think part of the challenge in something like this is we want to listen to each of you ongoing for hours. And of course, visually, it brings it to life all the more. I found myself very touched throughout. Weighty subjects. So I'm going to close with a quote by David Copperfield in his op-ed in the New York Times. Art has the ability to unite people into a collective mind. That's the real magic. What those in the hate business can't countenance. We have a duty to banish the idea that there's an us and a them. Thank you, everyone. Hear, hear.
Thank you. Hear, hear.
And thank you to SEEP for hosting this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
Yeah.